Jessica Yellin is an American award-winning journalist who was a former chief White House correspondent for CNN. She has also worked for ABC and MSNBC. In 2017, she launched News Not Noise, an independent news brand with over 1 million subscribers and followers across Instagram and other digital media, and a byword that reads, "We give you information, not a panic attack." We reached out to talk about following the most turbulent pre-election period ever, where she draws the line between fair coverage and hate speech, what will the 5th of November be like. We also discussed the Washington Post decision, Musk, Bezos and freedom of speech, and the danger of getting misled by bubbles and echo chambers. Hello, Ms. Yellin. Thank you very much for taking the time to share your insight on this year's election.
Thank you for having me. I'm so glad you all are interested.
But I want to start from last day's hot topic, let's say. What's your comment on Washington Post's recent decision not to endorse a candidate in the November 5th election?
I have a somewhat controversial position on this, which is I think it's a justifiable position executed badly. If they want to get out of the business of endorsements, which I understand in this polarized world, there's a rationale for that, but then it should be done long before it's days before the election. It could have been a very transparent process. They could have engaged their audience in a conversation about their decision-making, the stakes, the issues, how the information environment's changed, and then decided not to endorse, which could have built reader trust and even gotten reader buy-in into some of the challenges of being a journalist in this political environment and running a paper in this environment. But everything about how it went down eroded trust. NPR is reporting that they've lost 200,000 subscribers in days. And now the USA Today has announced they're not endorsing. And a third paper also said that. I can't remember which, maybe the LA Times.
Are you worried about the expansion of tech moguls like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos into the realm of information flow through controlling social or legacy media?
Yes. I mean, it's a weird reality because you need right now generous philanthropists to help support the press. We just do. And yet we also want to have a world in which there's an ethos around that of non-intervention. I think, that's a little pure and we have to be realistic. If you look at some of these people's businesses, when so much of their business is based on government contracts, for example, it is not surprising or irrational that they are concerned about the potential of suffering some sort of, retribution for what their newspaper does. And it's one of the, I think, crises in America right now that people have to be afraid of that and that it is a legitimate concern.
Yeah, that's why I believe so many people interpret Washington Post's non-endorsement on this timing as a matter-of-fact endorsement of Donald Trump in a reverse way.
I mean, I'm of two minds about that. Obviously, what you've said makes sense. We all see why that's the logical conclusion. It's also the case that, you want newspapers to reach people who are right, left, and center. We don't want to only have media brands that speak to a like-minded bubble. And maybe in the modern era, when so many people have so much access to information because of social media, because of the proliferation of podcasts like this, they're constantly bombarded with information. People have made up their minds a lot earlier, right? We are extremely locked into our political positions in America right now. And if a newspaper making an endorsement erodes trust with their audience because the audience perceives it as biased rather than reported objective reporting, I understand that there is a principled case to be made that the newspapers want to get out of this business. I'll tell you just briefly, in my audience, I have a very open-minded audience that values the free press. I was asked, why are newspapers endorsing still? That seems so wrong. How can they be neutral and independent if they're telling you who they want you to vote for? So maybe we're at a different moment and it makes sense to build viewer and reader trust by not doing this. But as I said, you have to have the conversation and not do it at the last minute because the owner says so.
Would you reach the point to believe that these tech moguls, set a threat to freedom of speech or opinion?
No. In this example, they run a newspaper. Like, they own a newspaper. They might be abrogating the important division between business and newsroom floor. But I don't think anybody's being denied speech. You know, if you're a journalist who feels that it's important to write this, you can leave and open a Substack, which is what I did. Like, I don't know, it's a private business. The freedom of speech doesn't mean you're allowed to say and do whatever you want inside a private business. That might be an unpopular position, but it's not illegal.
If you were shown some clips from the MSG Trump rally, like 15 years ago, would you believe it for real?
No. I mean, would I believe that this could happen? Yes. Would I believe that it would happen connected to a candidate for one of the two major political parties? No. I think that, I'm very careful about the language I use around labeling speech and actions, really because you don't want to overuse it so that when it really does matter, people respond. And there's no word for what so many of those people said on stage other than racist.
So
and you know what?
My question is, where should a journalist draw the line between fair coverage and the reproduction of hate speech?
Oh, that's an interesting, I get into this because I have to make those decisions. I work on social media. I decide what is posted in my community. And there are times I share things and people get mad and say, why are you amplifying this? And my view when I do that is it's not about amplifying a thing. It's about shining a spotlight, right? Sunshine's the greatest disinfectant. But I think it's the obligation of us as journalists to always put it in context. So I do that by literally writing on the video itself my commentary about what they're seeing. So there's never a time when you're just watching this racist rant in isolation for somebody to share it and just pass it along. When they're reading it, it says, this was a slur against Puerto Ricans that, is unprecedented in American political discourse at this level. It's generated enormous outrage, and the Trump campaign's distance itself from it. So you see that as you're watching the clip together. For me, that's the way I've solved for walking this line you're talking about.
Were you impressed that the Trump side, just a few days before the election, didn't tone down but went the full attack?
I mean, yes. Listen, in American politics, there's been this pattern where people run to the extreme part of their base, far to the right, far to the left, in the primary to stand out and win and energize most activists. And then in the general, they run to the center to appeal to moderates and independents and swing voters. And so you end up with some sort of centrist blob, right? We've seen Harris didn't have a primary, but she's certainly tacking to the center, trying to appeal to moderates and independents and centrists. Trump, you'd think he would do this, but he's doing the opposite. And his strategy in that, and that rally went further than I ever would have expected. And there's a lot of, if he doesn't win, there'll be a lot of discussion, like, was that very damaging, in particular, that rally and the strategy in general. But his goal is to energize his base and get them so excited that they will turn out, and simultaneously depress the swing voters that don't like either of them and Kamala's trying to win. The second part's easier to explain. They depress those voters by just generally sullying Kamala Harris and making them depressed about the system and think that nothing matters and their vote is pointless. In terms of energizing the base, which was the point of that rally, so many of Trump's most passionate supporters are not voters. The greatest prediction of future voting in America is past voting. If you voted in 4 elections before, you will vote again. Trump's voters haven't voted at all often. And so his challenge is to get them passionate enough that they make the effort. And so the thinking is that doing these kinds of things makes them feel like they're part of a club, part of a team. This point of view is never out in the open. Trump is like brave and daring enough to say these things, put it in people's face, and that'll energize these non-voters to get off the couch and show up.
Mm-hmm. Both as a citizen and, of course, as a journalist, professional journalist, have you experienced a more turbulent pre-election period?
No.
I mean, a couple of assassination attempts, Democrats' change of candidate.
It's bonkers. And everybody's bracing, holding onto their seat, wondering if something else happens before the election, you know.
Walk me through how did you deal with these events professionally?
I've learned to meditate. I've learned to take walks, to like practice having breaks, notice how you're doing. I also have gotten much more sensitive to how my audience feels about what's happening. In other words, I used to be the person who would just bombard you with the information over and over and over. And now I build in news breaks, pauses, moments of, I call it news that doesn't suck, moments that inspire awe, curiosity, hope for progress, and laughter to give us some relief. So that's how I cope with it. If you mean like, how does one prepare to cover this?
Mm-hmm.
Because
I'm not sure that someone can prepare for an assassination attempt.
You just have to be ready. Like, I'm, in a literal sense, I'm mobile. Like, I report on my phone, so it's with me. It means that you have to work all the time, right? Because stuff is always happening. But I also have learned to just ride the wave. And I realized I can't change the news or the world. I can only change me, right? And so I think it's important for all of us to shift how we engage with this.
Mm-hmm.
So even when the most crazy thing you've ever heard breaks, pause and breathe for a minute before you dive in.
Given also the fact that the news cycle has changed dramatically in comparison to the past.
It's not even a 6-hour news cycle. It's a, 60-second news cycle. By the time we're done with this podcast, who knows what will have happened?
How do you make sense of American politics right now? Or, over the past decades, to give it more context?
I'll give you a couple data points. I see things from the point of view of our information landscape, how information has changed our engagement with politics and one another. Let me start with this. In 2003, when I was a baby reporter, I was assigned to go to diners in swing states to interview Americans about our decision to go to war in Iraq. It was before we launched the war, but we were signaling it was coming. We all knew. And I was interviewing people and they would say one after another, oh gosh, we have to do this because of the Twin Towers and 9/11 and Osama bin Laden. And I'd say, there's been no evidence that Osama bin Laden is in Iraq or that Iraq has any connection whatsoever to taking down the Twin Towers. And person after person would say to me, oh, no, honey, not that we know of, but our government wouldn't take us to war, to vindicate 9/11 if they didn't know something they're not telling us. That was the level of trust that we had in government and institutions back then. Flash forward, I remember one exit poll after a big election was about loss of faith in government. And I started hearing my colleagues in the media repeat over and over that we've lost faith, which I think has the effect of teaching people to lose faith. And then we've had this evolution in the media that I think has had a profound impact on our politics, which is, in a nutshell, we learned that the one way to make money in press is by going negative, focusing on conflict, outrage, rage. It captures eyeballs. It worked. And so people started replicating it. My thesis is that's not the only way, but it's one way that worked, so they replicated it. All this is shown to cause people to drive polarization, drive negative thinking, loss of faith, and depression. What does depression do? Literally, it makes you more likely to engage with disinformation. Depressed people it's one of the biggest shared things among people who engage with disinformation. and disengage with civic life and mistrust one another.
Yes, at the end of the day, it promotes news avoidance.
Exactly. The negativity promotes news avoidance. You said it much more succinctly. Can you edit me? And then there's one more piece to this, which is then as this is happening, and if you look at the graphs, it's a negative hockey stick for trust in media, right? It's just plummeting through this period. And then at the same time as that's happening, all this technology comes online, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and the news orgs are not fast enough to adapt to it. They're not nimble enough to figure out what to do there. And who becomes successful are just influencers who are good at form. They learn how to make video. They gather these huge audiences, and after they become huge because they're good at video, they pivot to cover news and act as though they're journalists. But they have no standards that we have. They don't some are good, some are bad. It's just not journalism. And audiences now follow them and have a level of trust in them. There's 60% of people trust an influencer as much as a member of their own family.
What will November the 5th be like? Is there a place you pay more attention? Is there a story you find the most interesting and compelling on the election night?
Okay, those are two. I'll take them separately.
Okay.
On election night, what I'm going to watch for is the women's vote, because I think that a way to distill this is this year 2016, when we undercounted Trump support, especially among white men, rural voters? Or is this 2022, where we undercounted women's rage over losing access to abortion in this country, losing the agency that all of this speaks to?
After the overturn of Roe versus Wade.
Yes. And it goes beyond just access to abortion. I don't know how much your listeners know, but we're having reality here where women are dying because they have a miscarriage and hospitals won't perform an abortion, and healthy women are dying. So it speaks to everything about whether you can just not only plan your own family, go to work, have a career, speak for yourself, right? So is this an election in which that will determine who wins? Another interesting factor is the Puerto Rican vote. There are 5.8 million Puerto Ricans in America, enough in key swing states, almost 500,000 in Pennsylvania. They are all voters, and they could swing certain battleground states, red or blue. So I'm definitely going to be watching for those two factors.
After hearing that they live in a garbage island, right?
Did not go over well.
Yeah. Are you worried about the next day? Especially if Trump loses?
This was part of your question I didn't answer. What am I watching for on what will November 5th be like? And the big unknown is, will there be violence on November 5th? Will there be disturbing incidents and events? Even if it's not violence, the fear is people will show up with guns and walk around in an intimidating way. All manner of problems could erupt. I really hope not. We also had this fear in 2020, especially because people were so on edge during the pandemic. People were actually taking guns to state houses angered over lockdowns, and that did not materialize. There were isolated incidents of small problems that just didn't turn into something larger. So I'm very hopeful that remains the case, but I do worry about that. I also worry about contagion, where there's one small incident somewhere, it goes on social media, looks bigger than it is, and creates a larger crisis. So that's November 5th. I do know that governors and the federal government are game planning all sorts of plans to be able to rapidly react if there is, they call it unrest. So that's good, they're ready. And then as for election night, if Trump loses and doesn't concede, I think the biggest problem is if it's a very, very, very close tally, or it's just not done, right? If we don't have the counts. Now, the analysts I talked to say they think we will know election night. We might not have states called, but based on the turnout in certain places, how many women, how many rural voters, you can kind of model what's going to happen. I think we all have to be very careful about how we cover this. If Trump doesn't win and it's close, or even if he doesn't win, it's not close, I would expect that he'll declare himself the winner. And then media has to be very responsible about how we handle that.
Let's talk a little bit about your decision to leave legacy media and launch News Not Noise. And I wonder how different is working for an alternative new media, your own media. How different is the coverage of major political events such as the election?
I always say the best thing about my job is I get to decide every day what counts as news. The worst part of my job is that every day I have to decide what counts as news. So, it's like the joy and burden of freedom and independence. So the difference is that I am responsive to what the audience needs. So I answer questions. We engage directly. I can respond very quickly, and I can do what I said to you. It is important to me that I'm able to make assessments about, wow, this particular piece of video is simply too racist to share it. I don't want to. But I want to be on the record, so I want people to be aware, so I'm going to share this, and I'm going to put this context all around it. So for me, what I miss about the media orgs that I worked for is just, I didn't appreciate how much I could get done, right? I could call someone up. If they're available for an interview, I could just do it. I didn't have to worry about what it cost or do I have a person to do it, right? That's hard. And I miss the camaraderie of the newsroom, just my buddies in the newsroom. But I love the freedom and flexibility of this.
You've referred in the beginning of our conversation in this media bubble, in this liberal bubble. Was it something the press got wrong in the past 10, 15 years? Have liberal media underestimated Trump and the anger of his voters and the anger he inspires? While these media were addressing readers, viewers, followers who were already in agreement with them.
So I take a slightly different view on this. I left CNN in 2014. I came back to LA, where I'm from, and I go to a gym where there's 10 TVs in a row. And I remember watching from the moment Trump came down that escalator at Trump Tower to announce his candidacy, the coverage he got by mainstream media. He was not considered a serious contender at the time, but from that point forward, they started covering his empty podiums before he would speak, his announcements from Trump wines, his announcements of Trump steaks, anything he did, as they would constantly say, presidential candidate Trump, presidential candidate Trump, President Trump, President Trump, President Trump, normalizing in people's minds the concept of this candidate, this person as a serious candidate. I believe that the mainstream media did not treat Trump badly in the beginning of that primary. In fact, it was one of the primary drivers of his elevation to become the nominee. And I wrote a piece about that at the time. It's followed me ever since in ways that whatever. But I truly believe that it wasn't a liberal bias against him in the early days. It was a ratings bias for him that he was, quote, good TV. So they put him on as much as possible, and it made it possible for him to become the nominee. Then, after he became the nominee and his rhetoric, et cetera, turned very, jingoist, like anti-immigrant and quite problematic, then they turned so hard against him, it did seem partisan at that point, and I think that eroded trust. And then, because Trump works in opposition, his presidency, he needed an opponent. He wasn't running, so he made his opponent the media, and he engaged in this battle. And very often the press took the bait in ways that I thought were not productive. I think the biggest problem is that when you have two candidates that you're fact-checking, and one of them is telling falsehoods at a far greater rate than the other, you're compelled to fact-check that candidate more, and then you are seen as biased as the media.
Mixed and sound design by Aris Athanasopoulos. Produced by Panagiotis Menegos. You can listen to more podcasts by visiting podcast.imed.org.